Sofia Ramirez tightened the thin coat around her shoulders as the icy wind whipped through the narrow alley outside her apartment. It was barely dawn, the city's skyline painted in shades of steel gray and burnt orange as the first rays of sunlight struggled to cut through the winter morning haze. The world outside was waking up. Delivery trucks rumbled past, early commuters shuffled toward subway stations, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the corner bakery. But for Sofia, the morning was nothing new. Just another day of surviving. Inside her cramped one-bedroom apartment in Queens, her 5-year-old twins, Emma and Lucas, slept tangled together on a mattress they had long outgrown. Sofia lingered in the doorway of their makeshift bedroom, watching their peaceful faces, knowing that the moment she woke them, the chaos of the day would begin. She pressed a hand against her temple, already feeling the weight of the next 12 hours. Her phone vibrated on the counter. Past due, rent reminder. A pang of anxiety shot through her. She shoved the phone into her pocket. She didn't need another reminder of how precarious her situation was. As she tiptoed to the kitchen, the ancient coffee maker sputtered, its overworked motor groaning in protest. The warmth of the cheap brew did little to settle the tight knot in her stomach. Today was another double shift. First at the Hartwell Tower, where she worked as a cleaner, then a short break before her second job waitressing at a small diner off Fifth Avenue. The paycheck barely covered rent, food, and daycare expenses, but she had long stopped complaining. Complaining didn't change reality. She glanced at the cracked clock above the sink. 5:45 a.m. Time to move. "Mommy?" Emma's small, sleepy voice startled her. Sofia turned to see her daughter rubbing her eyes, her wild curls sticking out in every direction. Lucas groggily followed, yawning as he stretched his arms above his head. Sofia crouched down, forcing a smile. "Morning, my loves. Did you sleep okay?" Emma nodded. Lucas, still half asleep, leaned against his mother. "Are you working late again?" Guilt twisted in Sofia's chest. "Yes, baby, but I'll be back before bedtime." It was a lie. She wouldn't be home until well past midnight. But they didn't need to know that. She ushered them toward the tiny kitchenette, pouring bowls of cereal and heating up leftover toast. There was no time for anything else. As the twins ate, she rushed to get ready, slipping into her worn cleaning uniform and securing her long dark hair into a practical ponytail. She grabbed their small backpacks, stuffing them with snacks and a change of clothes before kneeling in front of them. "I need you to be good for Miss Valeria today, okay?" she said, referring to their babysitter. "No fighting, no running off." Emma and Lucas exchanged a look. Lucas hesitated before speaking. "Mommy, Miss Valeria says she's sick." Sofia's stomach dropped. "What?" Emma nodded solemnly. "She called last night. You were working." Panic gripped her. She fumbled for her phone, scrolling through missed calls, and sure enough, Valeria, 8:12 p.m. Sofia cursed under her breath. She had been too busy balancing trays at the diner, completely oblivious to the voicemail she had never checked. She had no backup plan. She thought of the few friends she had in the city, but everyone she knew was either at work or in equally desperate situations. Taking a day off wasn't an option. Missing a shift meant losing her job, and losing her job meant losing the small stability she had left. Her gaze flickered to the twins. She couldn't leave them alone. There was only one choice. "Come on, we're going on an adventure," she said, forcing a smile. "Where?" Emma asked, eyes brightening. Sofia took a steadying breath. "Mommy's work." By the time they arrived at Hartwell Tower, the morning rush had begun. The skyscraper loomed above them, a beacon of power and privilege in the heart of Manhattan. Businessmen in tailored suits strode past. Women in designer heels clicked across the marble floors, the scent of expensive perfume and freshly brewed espresso filling the grand lobby. This was a world Sophia existed in but never belonged to, a silent worker in the background of other people's success. She tightened her grip on the twins' hands, keeping them close as she walked toward the employee entrance. The security guard gave her a cursory glance but barely registered the children. Good. If she could just get them into the janitorial break room, they could stay hidden while she worked. They reached the service elevator, a stark contrast to the sleek mirrored ones in the main lobby. Sophia pressed the button, her heart hammering. The doors slid open, and she ushered the twins inside. As the doors shut, Lucas looked up at her. "Mommy, is this okay?" Emma and Lucas stood inside a lavish office, their tiny figures dwarfed by the massive leather chairs and floor-to-ceiling windows. Across from them, standing behind an enormous desk, was Ethan Hartwell. He was staring at them. Sophia's breath caught. Oh, God. Number Lucas's small hands were on the desk, while Emma's curious fingers reached for a decorative glass sculpture. Sophia wanted to scream, to rush in, to grab them and apologize 100 times over, but she was frozen in place. Then, the unthinkable happened. Emma smiled up at Ethan. "Are you the boss man?" she asked innocently. For a moment there was only silence. Ethan's sharp blue eyes flickered toward Sophia, his expression unreadable. Then, to her absolute horror, his lips twitched in something dangerously close to amusement. "Yes," he said, voice smooth but measured. "I suppose I am." Lucas, standing on tiptoe to peek at some papers, squinted up at him. "Do you tell Mommy what to do?" Sophia's heart plummeted. Ethan's gaze slid back to her, and something unreadable passed through his expression. His tone remained impassive, but there was the barest hint of curiosity behind it. "Your mother works here?" Sophia found her voice, but it was barely more than a whisper. "Yes, sir." She expected him to be angry, to demand why 2 small children had infiltrated his private office, to call security and have her thrown out. But instead, he remained eerily calm. His eyes lingered on her, then shifted back to Emma and Lucas. "And what exactly are you 2 doing in my office?" Emma grinned. "We were looking for Mommy." Sophia's entire body locked with fear. She had broken company rules. She had put her job at risk. Everything she had worked for was about to crumble. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his gaze sharp and assessing. Then, to her utter shock, his expression softened by a fraction. "I see." Sophia barely had time to process his reaction before the door swung open behind her. Daniel West, the COO of Hartwell Enterprises, a man notorious for his ruthless efficiency and unwavering commitment to corporate order. His gaze flickered between Sophia, the twins, and Ethan. The tension in the room instantly thickened. "What is the meaning of this?" Daniel demanded, eyes narrowing. "Sir, do you want me to call security?" Sophia's breath hitched. This was it, the moment she lost everything. But then Ethan spoke. "No," he said smoothly. "That won't be necessary." Daniel blinked. "Sir?" Ethan's gaze remained locked on Sophia. "Have HR send me the files on Ms. Ramirez. Immediately." Sophia's heart stopped. Daniel hesitated before nodding and exiting the room. Ethan turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "I believe we need to have a conversation, Ms. Ramirez." Sophia's legs trembled beneath her. She had walked into this building expecting to clean floors. Instead, she had just stepped into the center of the CEO's world. Sophia's breath came in shallow gasps as she stood frozen in the middle of Ethan Hartwell's expansive office. The weight of his sharp blue gaze bore into her, his expression unreadable. The twins, oblivious to the storm brewing around them, looked up at the powerful man as if he were just another adult they had yet to figure out. It was Lucas who broke the silence. "Mommy says you're the boss of everything here." He studied Ethan with a serious expression, as if trying to decide whether he approved of that. Ethan's lips twitched, almost as if he wanted to smile, but his composure remained intact. "Is that so?" he said smoothly, his voice carrying the kind of effortless authority that made grown men shrink in meetings. Sophia swallowed hard. "Sir, Ethan held up a hand, silencing her. "How exactly did you two manage to wander up here?" His question was directed at the children, though his gaze briefly flickered to her with something bordering on curiosity. Emma giggled. The elevator buttons were really shiny. Lucas nodded in agreement. "And nobody told us not to." Sophia clenched her fists, willing herself not to crumble under the unbearable tension. She needed to explain to fix this before she lost her job. But Ethan didn't seem enraged. If anything, he looked intrigued. Daniel West, the COO, stood stiffly in the doorway, his eyes darting between Ethan and the twins. His jaw twitched as if restraining himself from demanding security to escort them all out immediately. "Sir, if I may suggest—" Daniel started, but Ethan cut him off with a flick of his hand. "Not now, Daniel." His tone was calm but absolute, leaving no room for argument. Daniel clamped his mouth shut, his expression darkening. Sophia forced herself to breathe. This wasn't a nightmare, it was real. Her children had somehow bypassed security and ended up in the CEO's office, and yet he wasn't throwing them out. Ethan turned his attention back to Sophia. "Ms. Ramirez," he said, his voice devoid of anger but laced with curiosity. "Would you like to explain why two small children are wandering my executive floor unsupervised?" She felt the heat rise to her cheeks. There was no way to spin this in her favor. So she did what she always did. She told the truth. "My babysitter canceled this morning," she admitted, keeping her tone professional despite the sinking feeling in her chest. "I had no one else to watch them. I didn't want to miss my shift, so I brought them here. I left them in the break room, but clearly they had other plans." Ethan didn't immediately respond. Instead, he studied her with that same intense focus, as if trying to see past her words. "And you thought bringing them into a corporate environment was a suitable solution?" Sophia bristled. She knew how it sounded. Irresponsible, reckless, unprofessional. "I thought it was the only option I had," she said evenly, refusing to let her voice tremble. "I couldn't afford to lose a day's pay." Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the faint hum of the city beyond the glass windows, a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Ethan's expression didn't shift, but there was something thoughtful in his gaze, something unreadable. Then, to everyone's shock, he leaned back in his chair and addressed the twins. "Tell me, do you two always cause this much trouble?" Emma grinned. "Only sometimes." Lucas, emboldened by his sister's response, added, "But we're not bad. Mommy says we're curious." Ethan's lips twitched again, just barely. Sophia could hardly believe it. "Curiosity is important," Ethan said, "but so is following rules." His gaze flickered to Sophia once more, especially in a place like this. Sophia exhaled, bracing herself. This was it. He was going to fire her. But then he did something even more surprising. "Daniel," Ethan said, his voice steady but unreadable, "I need the HR files on Ms. Ramirez. Send them to my office within the hour." Daniel's head snapped toward Ethan, his features darkening. "Sir?" Did I stutter? Ethan's voice was deceptively calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Daniel hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding tightly. "Of course, sir." He sent Sophia a cold, warning glance before exiting the room. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. HR files? Why did Ethan Hartwell want her HR files? "Ms. Ramirez," Ethan said, drawing her attention back to him. His tone was measured, but there was something intentional behind it. "Do you like your current position here?" Her stomach twisted. This was it. He was finding a polite way to fire her, to say she wasn't fit for this job and that he was generously offering her a way out before security escorted her out the back door. But instead of panic, something inside her hardened. If she was going to lose her job, she would do so with dignity. "I work hard," she said carefully. "I don't have the luxury of liking or disliking it. I do what I need to do to provide for my children." Ethan studied her for a long moment before nodding slightly, as if that was the answer he had expected. Then he stood, smoothing out his expensive charcoal suit, his movements calculated and precise. The conversation was over. "You may return to your shift, Ms. Ramirez," he said smoothly. "Leave the children with my assistant. She will watch over them until you finish your work for the day." Sophia blinked, stunned. "What?" Ethan arched a brow, as if he found her reaction amusing. "Surely you weren't expecting me to let them roam the building again." She had expected him to fire her. She had expected security to escort her out. But this? "Why?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Ethan's blue eyes held hers, his expression unreadable. For the first time, she saw something behind the coldness, something she couldn't quite place. "Because I want to see something," he said simply. Then, as if that explained everything, he turned back to his desk, dismissing her. Sophia's legs trembled as she took the twins' hands, leading them toward the door, her mind racing. Ethan Hartwell had just made a decision, one that would alter the course of her life forever, and she had no idea why. Sophia's hands trembled as she stepped out of Ethan Hartwell's office, her twins clinging to her sides. Her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Ethan Hartwell, one of the most powerful men in New York, had not only spared her job, but had arranged for someone to watch over her children while she worked. Why? A billionaire like him had no reason to concern himself with someone like her, a janitor struggling to make ends meet. Yet, something in his piercing blue eyes had hinted at a depth she couldn't quite decipher. "Mommy, who was that man?" Emma asked, her tiny hand tightening around Sophia's fingers. Sophia exhaled sharply, kneeling to meet her children's curious gazes. "That's my boss," she said carefully, "and you two just met one of the most important men in this whole building." Lucas grinned. "He doesn't seem scary. He looks kinda sad." Sophia stilled at her son's words. Sad? Ethan Hartwell had been distant, powerful, and unreadable. But sad? She wasn't sure how a 5-year-old could pick up on something she hadn't even noticed. Before she could respond, a polished woman in her late 50s approached them. Her silver hair was styled into a sharp bob, and her tailored suit suggested a level of authority. Sophia immediately straightened, her protective instincts kicking in. "I'm Margaret Owens," the woman said, offering a firm nod. "Mr. Hartwell's executive assistant. He has asked me to watch your children while you finish your shift." Sophia swallowed hard. Thank you, but I can't possibly impose." Margaret lifted a hand, cutting her off. "It's not an imposition, Ms. Ramirez. Mr. Hartwell's orders are not up for debate." Her voice was calm, but there was an unspoken finality in her tone that made Sophia realize arguing would be futile. Instead, she looked down at Emma and Lucas, uncertainty pooling in her chest. "Will we see the boss man again?" Emma asked innocently. Margaret's lips twitched slightly. "That depends on how much trouble you cause, young lady." Lucas gasped dramatically. "We never cause trouble." Sophia let out a breathless laugh before pressing a kiss to each of their foreheads. "You two behave, okay? I'll be back as soon as my shift is over." As Margaret led them away, Sophia felt an odd pang in her chest. Ethan Hartwell had no reason to care about her or her kids. So why did he? Sophia returned to her usual rounds, but the entire day felt different. Every interaction, every whisper, every glance from her co-workers felt weighted with curiosity. As she mopped the sleek floors of the executive wing, she caught snippets of conversation. "Did you hear? The janitor's kids were in Mr. Hartwell's office this morning." She's lucky she didn't get fired. Why would the CEO take an interest in her? Heat crept up Sophia's neck, but she kept her head down and her hands moving. She had learned long ago that attention from the powerful was rarely a good thing. As she moved toward the break room, she nearly collided with Lisa Carter, one of the senior executives. Lisa was in her mid-40s, with sharp brown eyes and an air of confidence that made her presence undeniable. Unlike many of the other higher-ups, Lisa had always been polite to Sophia, though their interactions had been minimal. "Ms. Ramirez," Lisa greeted, crossing her arms, "I hear you had quite the morning." Sophia stiffened. It was unexpected. Lisa studied her for a moment before lowering her voice. "A word of advice. Be careful." Sophia frowned. "Careful of what?" Lisa sighed, glancing down the hallway before leaning in slightly. "Mr. Hartwell is an enigma. He doesn't do things without reason, and if he's taken an interest in you, people are going to talk. People like Daniel West." Sophia's stomach twisted. Lisa continued, "Daniel doesn't like anyone disrupting the balance of power. If he sees you as a threat, or worse, as someone gaining Mr. Hartwell's favor, he will make things difficult for you." Sophia's pulse quickened. She barely understood why Ethan Hartwell had given her a second chance. And now she had to worry about office politics too. Lisa must have seen the turmoil on her face because her voice softened. "Just keep your head down and do your job. If you need anything, come to me." Sophia blinked, startled. "Why would you help me?" Lisa hesitated before giving her a small, knowing smile. "Because I know what it's like to start from the bottom in a place that wasn't built for you." With that, she walked away, leaving Sophia standing in the empty corridor, her mind reeling. Sophia thought she had made it through the day without further incident, but as she pushed her supply cart toward the service elevator, a voice stopped her cold. "You certainly made an impression this morning." She turned to find Daniel West leaning against the wall, his expensive suit crisp and his expression unreadable. Sophia forced herself to remain calm. "Mr. West?" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You must be quite special if Mr. Hartwell is suddenly taking an interest in you." Sophia bristled. "I don't know what you're implying, but I assure you, I'm just here to do my job." Daniel's gaze darkened. "Then let me give you some advice, Ms. Ramirez. This world, it doesn't take kindly to outsiders trying to climb higher than their station. If you think a single act of kindness from Mr. Hartwell means you have a future here beyond cleaning floors, you're sorely mistaken." Sophia clenched her jaw, but before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Daniel." Both of them turned to find Ethan Hartwell himself standing at the end of the hallway. His expression was blank, but his presence was undeniable. Daniel immediately straightened, adopting a more respectful posture. "Sir." Ethan's gaze flickered between them before landing on Daniel with a cold finality. "Find someone else to bother." The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel hesitated for only a second before nodding stiffly and walking away. Sophia exhaled slowly, turning back to Ethan. "I didn't need you to do that." Ethan's expression remained unreadable. "Perhaps not, but I dislike people who waste their breath on intimidation." She studied him carefully. "Why are you helping me?" For the first time, something flickered in Ethan's gaze, something raw, fleeting, and almost vulnerable. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted. Then, before she could respond, he turned on his heel and strode away, leaving her standing there, heart pounding. Ethan Hartwell had saved her job. He had protected her from Daniel. He had taken an interest in her children, and yet the biggest question remained. Why? The following morning, Sophia felt the weight of the previous day still pressing on her shoulders. The unusual events, the twins meeting Ethan Hartwell, his surprising decision to spare her job, and the veiled warnings from both Lisa Carter and Daniel West, all swirled in her mind. She had tried to rationalize it, to convince herself that it was nothing more than a fluke. But Ethan Hartwell didn't do things without reason, and she had no idea why she was suddenly on his radar. As she walked through the cold morning air toward Hartwell Tower, she squeezed her twins' hands gently. Today, Margaret Owens, Ethan's assistant, had arranged for them to stay in a designated lounge, usually reserved for VIP guests, far away from the janitorial break room. It was too much generosity, too much attention. But Sophia didn't have the luxury of turning it down. "Mommy, will we see the boss man today?" Emma asked as they approached the revolving doors. "I hope not," Sophia muttered under her breath. Lucas grinned. "I think he likes us." Sophia forced a smile, but she couldn't shake the unease curling in her stomach. What did Ethan Hartwell want from her? Sophia spent the morning working in silence, keeping her head down as she scrubbed and polished her way through the executive floor. The whispers had only grown louder. She could feel the stares, the judgment in the eyes of those who had worked in the building long before she had. By noon, she had convinced herself that Ethan had moved on, that the previous day had been nothing more than a temporary lapse in the usual indifference of the rich and powerful. Then Margaret Owens appeared. "Ms. Ramirez," she said briskly, standing in the doorway of a supply closet where Sophia had just been restocking cleaning supplies. "Mr. Hartwell would like to see you." Sophia's heart stopped. Oh no. She forced herself to remain calm. "Did he say why?" Margaret gave her a knowing look. "Number. And I would suggest not keeping him waiting." Sophia swallowed hard. Her hands, still damp from cleaning solution, curled into fists as she followed Margaret down the hall. Every step felt heavier than the last. By the time she reached his office, her pulse was hammering. Margaret knocked once before pushing the door open. "Ms. Ramirez." Ethan's smooth, commanding voice greeted her from behind his desk. "Come in." She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before stepping inside. The doors clicked shut behind her. Ethan was impeccably dressed as always, his navy blue suit tailored to perfection. He leaned back in his leather chair, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. His office was vast, sleek, and utterly impersonal, yet something about him in this space made him seem isolated. He motioned toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit." Sophia hesitated. "I still have work to do, sir." His lips twitched, almost as if he were amused by her reluctance. "It can wait." Taking a slow breath, she sat, hands clasped in her lap. "Is something wrong?" Ethan studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. "Number. But I'm curious about something." Her stomach tightened. "Curious about what?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Why are you here?" Sophia frowned. "Because I work here." "That's not what I meant," he said smoothly. "Why this job? Why not something better suited to your intelligence?" She stiffened. "Because I don't have the luxury of choice." Ethan nodded slightly, as if he had expected that answer. His gaze drifted toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, where the city stretched out in endless steel and glass. "I wasn't born into this," he said suddenly, his voice quieter than before. Sophia blinked. "This question mark?" He turned back to her. "People assume I've always been wealthy, but that's not the case. I started with nothing." She frowned. "You built this company from the ground up?" "No," he admitted. "I inherited it, but I had to fight to keep it." There was something raw in his tone, something almost vulnerable beneath the polished veneer. Sophia had never imagined Ethan Hartwell as anything other than untouchable, but now she saw cracks in the armor. "You work hard," he said finally, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "I respect that." Sophia didn't know what to say. Praise from someone like him felt out of place, especially when it was directed at someone like her. Before she could respond, he continued, "I have an offer for you." She tensed. "An offer?" Ethan folded his hands together on the desk. "A position in administration, better hours, better pay, a real chance to build something for yourself." Sophia's pulse skyrocketed. "What?" "You'd report directly to Margaret," he said casually, as if he hadn't just turned her entire world upside down with a single statement. "I believe you're capable of more than mopping floors, Ms. Ramirez." She shook her head, struggling to comprehend. This couldn't be real. "Why?" she demanded. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan held her gaze, and for the first time she saw something unguarded in his expression, something she couldn't quite name. "Because I want to see what you'll do with the opportunity," he said simply. Sophia opened her mouth to protest, to argue, to tell him that she couldn't just step into a world she didn't belong to. But she wasn't just thinking about herself. She was thinking about Emma and Lucas. She was thinking about how tired she was of struggling just to survive. She was thinking about how, for the first time in years, someone was offering her a way out. The room was heavy with silence. Finally, she inhaled deeply and met Ethan's gaze. "What's the catch?" His lips twitched again, but this time it almost looked like a real smile. "Smart question." She waited. "There is no catch," he said finally, "unless you consider change itself a risk." Sophia's mind whirled. This was insane. This was impossible. This was an opportunity. And maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something else entirely. Sophia sat in the break room, her hands still trembling from the conversation with Ethan Hartwell. The offer had been generous, too generous. The kind of opportunity she had never expected, let alone from someone like him. An administrative position, better hours, more pay, a chance to break free from the cycle she had been trapped in. And yet, something about it felt too easy. Was this pity? A favor? Some rich man's fleeting amusement with a struggling single mother? She had replayed his words over and over in her head, trying to decipher the real meaning behind them. But the truth was, she didn't know if she could trust him. Just as she was about to return to her shift, a presence darkened the doorway. Daniel West. His sharp, calculating gaze swept over her as he leaned casually against the frame. Everything about him was polished, his suit, his posture, his cold smirk. But beneath it all, there was something unsettling, something predatory. "Congratulations," he said smoothly. "I hear you're moving up in the world." Sophia stiffened. She hadn't accepted Ethan's offer yet, but clearly, Daniel already knew. "I haven't made a decision," she said carefully. Daniel chuckled, stepping into the room. "Come on, Ms. Ramirez, let's not play games. We both know Ethan doesn't just hand out jobs to janitors." His voice lowered slightly, his tone turning condescending. "What exactly did you do to earn such favor?" Sophia's blood ran cold. She had dealt with people like Daniel before, men who thought power gave them the right to undermine and degrade anyone they saw as beneath them. She squared her shoulders. "I earn everything I have." Daniel gave a slow nod as if considering her words. "Of course you do. But tell me, do you really think someone like you belongs up there? In his world?" Sophia clenched her fists under the table. There it was. The reminder that she would never fit in, that she would always be seen as the outsider, the girl from the wrong side of the city who didn't deserve to rise. But before she could respond, he leaned in slightly. "Be careful, Ms. Ramirez. Ethan might enjoy saving people, but he also gets bored easily, and when he does, well, you'll be right back where you started." Sophia met his gaze, refusing to look away. "Maybe, but at least I won't be the one afraid of losing power when that happens." Something flickered in Daniel's eyes, something dark and dangerous. But before he could say another word, a voice interrupted. "Ms. Ramirez." She turned to see Lisa Carter standing in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence alone sent a clear message to Daniel. He wasn't in control here. Daniel's smirk returned, though it was tighter now. "Enjoy your promotion, while it lasts." Then, with a calculated glance at Lisa, he strode out of the room, leaving a chill in his wake. Sophia exhaled sharply, her hands still curled into fists. She hated how easily people like Daniel could make her feel small. Lisa crossed her arms. "He's not wrong, you know." Sophia frowned. "Excuse me?" Lisa sighed, stepping further into the room. "Ethan doesn't just hand out jobs. If he's offering you a position, he sees something in you. But that doesn't mean everyone else will. And people like Daniel? They'll do everything in their power to make sure you fail." Sophia looked away. "I never asked for this." "No, but you have it now. So the question is, what are you going to do with it?" Sophia swallowed hard. She had spent her entire life fighting to survive, to provide for her children, to make sure they had a future brighter than her own. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. The next morning, Sophia stood in front of the Hartwell Tower HR office, nerves twisting inside her like a hurricane. Margaret Owens greeted her with a professional nod. "Mr. Hartwell is expecting you. Are you ready?" Sophia inhaled deeply. "Ready?" Number. But she was here, and that was enough. She followed Margaret up to the executive floor, where she had only ever been with a mop in hand. But today she wasn't here to clean. Today she was walking into an office that had once been closed to her. Margaret gestured toward the door. "Go on in." With one last steadying breath, Sophia stepped inside. Ethan was standing by the window, his back to her as he looked out over the city. He turned at the sound of the door closing behind her, his expression unreadable as always. "You came," he said simply. Sophia lifted her chin. "I need this job, and if I'm going to take it, I want to earn it. No favors. No handouts." Something flickered in his eyes. Approval, perhaps. "Then let's get to work." And just like that, Sophia Ramirez stepped into a world she had never belonged to, and she had no idea how much it was about to change her. Sophia sat at her new desk, her hands resting on the smooth mahogany surface, feeling completely out of place. Hartwell Enterprises' administrative floor was an entirely different world. The polished floors, the soft hum of productivity, the crisp scent of expensive coffee. It was nothing like the janitorial supply closet she had once called her workspace. She had only been in her new role for 2 days, and already the stares and whispers had intensified. People were watching her, some with curiosity, some with disapproval. And then there was Daniel West. The COO had made it abundantly clear that he didn't trust her, or, more accurately, that he resented her presence. Sophia ignored the tension as best she could, focusing on learning. She wasn't going to waste this opportunity. If Ethan Hartwell wanted to see what she could do, then she'd prove to him and to herself that she belonged here. By midday, Sophia had familiarized herself with most of her duties, but the software system used for internal reports was far more complicated than she had expected. She had spent nearly an hour trying to navigate it when a warm cup of coffee was placed beside her. She looked up to see Lisa Carter standing there, arms crossed but a small, knowing smile on her face. Figured you could use a break, Lisa said, sitting on the edge of Sophia's desk. First week is always hell. Sophia exhaled. It's a lot, but I'll get it. Lisa nodded. I have no doubt. You remind me of myself when I started here, determined, out of place, underestimated. Sophia blinked. You started at the bottom? Lisa smirked. Not exactly as far down as janitorial staff, but I was an assistant. And back then, women didn't get far in this company unless they fought for it. Sophia studied her. Lisa carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had clawed her way to success, rather than inherited it. She respected that. Thank you, Sophia said softly. Lisa waved a dismissive hand. Don't thank me yet. Just keep proving people wrong. That afternoon, Sophia was deep into reviewing a financial report when Daniel West appeared at her desk. His presence alone sent a chill up her spine, but she forced herself to remain composed. Ms. Ramirez, Daniel said smoothly, his eyes scanning her desk. I assume you're catching on quickly. Sophia lifted her chin. I am. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Excellent. Then you won't mind handling a special assignment for me. Sophia's stomach clenched. This was a test. Of course, she said evenly. Daniel set a thick folder down in front of her. I need an internal audit of last quarter's expense reports from our Paris and London divisions. I expect a summary by tomorrow morning. Sophia's pulse quickened. She had barely grasped the basics of the company's systems, and this was far more than a standard task. It was a deliberate challenge. She met his gaze, refusing to show hesitation. I'll have it ready. Daniel gave a slow smirk. Good. Let's see if you really deserve this position. He walked away, leaving Sophia staring at the daunting stack of documents. This was a power play, a test to see if she would fail. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. Hours later, long after most of the staff had left for the day, Sophia was still at her desk, rubbing her temples as she tried to make sense of the data. She was drowning. You're still here. She nearly jumped at the voice. Looking up, she found Ethan Hartwell standing in the doorway to his office, his tie slightly loosened, the first real sign of imperfection she had seen in his otherwise flawless appearance. I have work to finish, she said, sitting up straighter. He stepped into the room, eyeing the stack of documents. Daniel gave you this, didn't he? Sophia hesitated. Yes. Ethan exhaled, a flicker of annoyance crossing his expression. He wants you to fail. She already knew that. But what she didn't know was why Ethan seemed to care. I can handle it, she said. Ethan studied her for a moment, then gestured toward his office. Come with me. Sophia hesitated. Being alone with Ethan Hartwell wasn't exactly something she had prepared for, but refusing wasn't an option. She followed him into his office, the door clicking shut behind her. Sit, he instructed, motioning toward the leather chair across from his desk. Sophia complied, watching as Ethan walked to a cabinet, pulled out a bottle of single malt scotch, and poured himself a glass. He lifted the bottle slightly, silently offering, but she shook her head. Smart, he said, sipping his drink before settling into his chair. Sophia cleared her throat. Why am I here, Mr. Hartwell? He smirked slightly. You don't waste time. I like that. She waited, nerves thrumming in her veins. Finally, Ethan leaned forward. Daniel is threatened by you. Sophia blinked. That doesn't make sense. I'm not a threat. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Not yet, but you will be. A shiver ran down her spine. Why do you care? For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, in a rare moment of candor, he said, Because I know what it's like to have someone try to bury you before you've had a chance to prove yourself. Sophia's breath hitched. She hadn't expected that. She looked down at the files. Are you telling me not to do the audit? Number, I'm telling you to be smart about it. Daniel wants to overwhelm you. Don't let him. Work efficiently. Use the tools available to you. If you need help, ask Lisa. Sophia absorbed his words, feeling an odd warmth spread through her chest. This wasn't charity. He wasn't handing her an easy way out. He was telling her to fight back. She nodded slowly. I understand. Ethan studied her for another long moment, then set his drink down. Good. Now get some rest. You'll need it. Sophia stood, suddenly aware of just how close they were. Something charged lingered in the air between them, something neither of them addressed. As she turned to leave, Ethan's voice stopped her. Sophia. She turned back, surprised to hear her first name. He held her gaze. Don't let them break you. She swallowed hard, nodded, and stepped out of the office, her heart pounding. For the first time since she had taken this job, she truly believed she could do this. And she had a feeling Ethan Hartwell wasn't done surprising her yet. Sophia barely slept that night. Her mind raced with everything that had happened. The impossible challenge Daniel had given her, the quiet warning from Lisa, and the unexpected conversation with Ethan Hartwell. His words had lingered long after she left his office. Don't let them break you. She wasn't sure why, but Ethan's belief in her felt like an anchor in the storm. He hadn't offered her an easy way out, but he had given her the encouragement she hadn't even known she needed, and that terrified her. Because if she started to believe in him, she'd start expecting more from him. And that was dangerous. The next morning, Sophia arrived at the office before sunrise, determined to finish the audit before Daniel could claim she was incapable. She had spent hours studying the system, using every tool available, triple-checking every report. At 8 a.m. sharp, she printed out her summary, clipped it neatly together, and walked it straight to Daniel's office. She knocked twice. "Come in," came his clipped voice. Sophia stepped inside, keeping her posture straight as she placed the report on his desk. Daniel barely looked at her. He took the folder, flipped it open, and skimmed the contents. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then he set the folder down and looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "You had help." Sophia lifted her chin. "No, I had determination." Daniel's lips curled into something resembling a smirk. "I'll admit, I didn't expect you to finish it." "I told you I could handle it," she said evenly. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Fine. You've proven you can follow instructions. But let's see if you can handle real pressure." Sophia braced herself as he slid another file across the desk. "The executive budget forecast for the next quarter. You have 2 days." She clenched her jaw. Of course he wasn't going to make this easy. But she wasn't going to quit. She picked up the file, nodded, and left without another word. That evening, Sophia found herself alone in the executive lounge, poring over spreadsheets and forecasting data, her eyes blurring with exhaustion. She had barely touched her coffee, too focused on getting the numbers right. She was so lost in concentration that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her until a deep voice broke the silence. "You should eat something." Sophia jumped, her heart pounding as she looked up to see Ethan Hartwell standing at the entrance of the lounge. He was dressed in a dark navy suit, his tie loosened just enough to make him look slightly less intimidating. But it was his eyes that caught her off guard. There was something unsettled in them, something almost vulnerable. She quickly straightened. "I'm fine." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You don't look fine." Sophia let out a small, exhausted laugh. "I don't have time to look fine." His gaze flickered to the massive stack of papers in front of her. "Daniel gave you another impossible task, didn't he?" She sighed, running a hand over her face. "Of course he did." Ethan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, his presence filling the small space between them. "And yet, you're still here." She met his gaze. I can't afford to fail. Ethan studied her for a long moment before exhaling. Neither could I. Sophia frowned. What do you mean? He hesitated for just a second before leaning back in his chair. My father built this company, but he never wanted me to run it. I had to prove I was capable, again and again. And every time I did, he raised the bar higher. Sophia's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. Ethan had always seemed like a man who had everything. The thought of him fighting to earn his place in his own company was shocking. What happened? She asked quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened. I outworked him. I became the one thing he couldn't control. And when he died, I took everything he left behind and made it better. Sophia's chest tightened. There was something so raw, so unspoken in his voice, a lifetime of expectations, pressure, and battles fought in silence. Is that why you work so much? She asked softly. Ethan looked at her, something flickering in his expression. It's all I know. Sophia exhaled slowly, a strange understanding settling between them. She knew that feeling. The exhaustion, the endless fight to prove yourself, the fear that if you stopped moving, even for a second, you'd lose everything. You should go home, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Rest. I'll deal with Daniel. Sophia shook her head. I don't want special treatment. He smirked slightly. That's not what I'm offering. I'm just saying you don't have to do it alone. For a moment, Sophia didn't know what to say, because the idea of not being alone in this fight was something she had never considered before, and Ethan Hartwell was making her reconsider everything. Sophia barely saw Ethan the next day. She was too busy completing Daniel's latest challenge, making sure every number was perfect, every projection airtight. By the time she submitted the report, she was mentally and physically exhausted. Daniel reviewed it in silence before finally closing the folder and setting it aside. Not bad. Sophia exhaled. Does that mean I passed your test? Daniel smirked. For now. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned before looking back at her. Mr. Hartwell has called a meeting. You should be there. Sophia frowned. A meeting? Why? Daniel stood, adjusting his cuffs. I suppose we're about to find out. When Sophia walked into the boardroom, she was surprised to see several senior executives already seated, including Lisa Carter. Ethan stood at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. As of today, he began, his voice calm but firm, I'm implementing new oversight measures for financial reporting. Effective immediately, Sophia Ramirez will be assisting with internal audits. Sophia's stomach dropped. Daniel's jaw tightened. Sir, Ethan cut him off. I need someone I can trust in this role, and Sophia has already proven she's more than capable. Sophia's pulse thundered. This wasn't just another challenge. This was a declaration. Ethan Hartwell had just placed his trust in her, publicly. She swallowed hard as Daniel's glare burned into her, but she kept her gaze on Ethan, because she finally realized something. This wasn't just about a job anymore. Ethan Hartwell had just changed everything, and Sophia wasn't sure if she was ready for it. Sophia felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Ethan Hartwell had just publicly placed his trust in her, giving her a role she hadn't asked for but somehow couldn't refuse. The weight of his decision settled on her shoulders as every executive in the room turned their attention toward her. Daniel West looked like he had just swallowed glass. His jaw clenched and his fingers curled into fists against the table. This is highly irregular, Daniel said, keeping his voice smooth, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. Ms. Ramirez is not qualified for this level of oversight. Ethan barely blinked. She's demonstrated competence beyond expectation. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. That doesn't mean she should be handling executive audits. Ethan leaned forward, his fingers steepled. I believe that decision falls under my discretion, does it not? Silence. No one dared to challenge the CEO. Lisa Carter, seated to Sophia's left, sent her a quick glance, one of quiet support. But Sophia could feel the unspoken battle brewing in the room. Daniel wouldn't take this lying down. Ethan's gaze flickered toward her. Do you accept the position, Ms. Ramirez? Sophia's pulse thundered. She knew what this meant. Taking this role wouldn't just be about proving herself, it would be about surviving in a world that didn't want her there. But Ethan was giving her a chance, and she wasn't about to back down. I accept, she said, keeping her voice steady. Ethan nodded. Then it settled. Daniel's jaw clenched, but he said nothing as the meeting adjourned. But Sophia knew this wasn't over. Over the next few days, Sophia immersed herself in her new responsibilities, working harder than she ever had. She wasn't going to let anyone, especially Daniel, see her as unworthy. She triple-checked every financial report, cross-referenced every number, and met with Lisa when she had questions. Ethan, true to his word, gave her space to prove herself, but she could feel his presence lingering, watching, assessing. But it wasn't unwanted. It was something else, something she couldn't allow herself to name. She was too busy fighting to keep her place, which was why she didn't see it coming. Sophia was in the middle of reviewing an expense report when security appeared at her desk. Ms. Ramirez, we need you to come with us. Her stomach dropped. What? Why? The guard didn't answer. Lisa rushed over, frowning. What's going on? The lead guard, a burly man with a no-nonsense expression, handed her a folded document. We have reason to believe Ms. Ramirez has been involved in fraudulent financial activity. Sophia froze. What? Lisa snapped, grabbing the document. That's ridiculous. Sophia's mouth went dry. Fraud? A dozen eyes were on her as whispers spread like wildfire through the office. She had fought so hard to prove herself, and now this. I don't understand, Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel West appeared, a calculated expression of disappointment on his face. I warned you, Ms. Ramirez. You didn't belong here. Sophia's heart plummeted. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a setup. Lisa turned to Daniel, her eyes flashing. You did this. Daniel shrugged. The evidence says otherwise. Sophia felt her knees lock. No. She turned toward the only person who could fix this. Ethan. He stood in his office doorway, watching the scene unfold. But his face was unreadable. For the first time since she had met him, she couldn't tell what he was thinking. She willed him to step forward, to say something, to believe in her the way he had before. But he didn't. He just stood there. And that was all Daniel needed. Take her to the compliance office, Daniel ordered. The guards flanked her, and before she could say another word, she was escorted away. And Ethan Hartwell let it happen. Sophia sat in a cold, sterile room, hands clenched in her lap. The compliance officer, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, flipped through the so-called evidence. Several transactions were linked to your login credentials, the woman said. Unauthorized budget approvals, misdirected funds. Sophia shook her head. That's impossible. I never approved anything without oversight. Lisa, who had barged into the meeting uninvited, crossed her arms. She's being framed, and we all know who's behind it. The officer sighed. That's not my call. I have to report my findings to Mr. Hartwell. Sophia flinched. Ethan, did he even believe her? Did he care? Or had he doubted her all along? She barely heard the rest of the conversation. All she could think about was how Ethan had stood there and done nothing. 2 hours later, Sophia left the compliance office with a suspension notice in her hands. Lisa walked beside her, fuming. "This is complete bullshit." Sophia swallowed the lump in her throat. "Doesn't matter." Lisa grabbed her arm. "Of course it matters. You didn't do this." Sophia exhaled shakily. "Tell that to Ethan." Lisa's expression darkened. "I will." But Sophia knew it wouldn't matter. Ethan had already made his choice. She gathered her belongings, avoiding the stares and whispers as she walked through the office for what she knew was the last time. And as she stepped into the elevator, leaving behind the world she had fought so hard to be part of, she realized something painful. Ethan Hartwell had saved her once, but this time he had let her fall. Sophia sat on the worn-out couch in her tiny apartment, staring blankly at the suspension notice in her hands. It had been hours since she had walked out of Hartwell Enterprises, but the disbelief still clung to her like a second skin. Fraud. The accusation echoed in her mind, hollow and cruel. She had spent her life working, sacrificing, clawing her way up from nothing, only to have it ripped away in an instant. And worst of all, Ethan Hartwell had let it happen. Her chest ached as she recalled the way he had stood in that doorway, silent as she was escorted out. Not a single word, not a single objection. And that silence had told her everything she needed to know. A soft sniffle snapped her out of her thoughts. Sophia turned to see Emma and Lucas watching her from the doorway of their small bedroom. "Mommy?" Lucas's voice was hesitant. Sophia wiped at her face, not even realizing she had been crying. "Come here, baby." The twins rushed into her arms, curling up against her, their small bodies warm and trusting. She had lost the job, lost the chance to build something better for them, but she still had them, and no one, not Ethan, not Daniel, not the world, could take that away. "We'll be okay," she murmured, pressing a kiss into their hair. "I promise." But deep down, she wasn't sure how. Ethan's guilt. Ethan sat alone in his penthouse apartment, nursing a glass of whiskey as he stared out at the glittering skyline of New York City. The city that he had conquered, the city that had made him rich, powerful, untouchable. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. He had let Sofia Ramirez be dragged out of his company under false pretenses, and he had done nothing to stop it. The image of her face, shocked, betrayed, devastated, was burned into his memory. He had seen doubt in her eyes, doubt in him, and it infuriated him. He had never doubted her, not for a second. The moment Daniel had accused her of fraud, Ethan had known it was a setup. The evidence had been too convenient, too perfectly arranged. But he had played the long game his whole life, waiting, watching, moving only when the time was right. And now, he had waited too long. He ran a frustrated hand through his hair. He needed to fix this. But would Sophia even let him? The fight to rebuild. For the next week, Sophia focused on survival. She spent hours searching for work, calling old employers, doing anything she could to keep money coming in. But New York was ruthless, and with her recent suspension at Hartwell Enterprises hanging over her, no one wanted to take a chance on her. She returned to waitressing at a small diner, working long shifts for little pay, feeling the weight of failure press heavier each day. But she refused to break. She had made a promise to her children, and she wouldn't let them down. One afternoon, after another grueling shift, she was locking up the diner when a black luxury car pulled up to the curb. Her stomach tightened. "Ethan." He stepped out of the car, his navy blue suit perfect as always, but there was something different in his eyes, something almost hesitant. "Sophia." She swallowed the lump in her throat, turning back to lock the diner door. "I have nothing to say to you. I need to talk to you." She let out a hollow laugh, crossing her arms. Now you want to talk? Ethan's jaw tightened. I know you're angry. Oh, you have no idea. The tension crackled between them like a live wire. Ethan stepped closer, his voice lower. I know you didn't do it. Sophia froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. For days, she had replayed that moment in her head, the moment he had let her walk away. And now, he decided to say this? You knew? Her voice was barely a whisper, but the anger in it was razor sharp. You knew I was innocent and you still let them drag me out like a criminal? Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. It wasn't that simple. It was that simple, she snapped, stepping closer, her pain finally breaking through the surface. You had the power to stop it, Ethan. You could have said something. You could have defended me, but you just stood there. His eyes darkened. I was trying to find out who was behind it. Sophia let out a bitter laugh. So you decided to watch me lose everything while you played detective? I needed proof, he said, his voice tight. If I had spoken too soon, Daniel would have buried it deeper. I needed to make sure I could take him down for good. Sophia shook her head, a bitter taste in her mouth. And in the meantime, I lost my job, my reputation, and my chance at a better life. Ethan's jaw clenched. I made a mistake. The words hung in the air, heavy and real. He had never admitted fault before, but it wasn't enough. I don't need your apologies, she said quietly. I needed you when it mattered. Ethan reached for her, but she stepped back. She couldn't let him touch her, not now. Not when she was still trying to hold herself together. I'm going to fix this, he said, his voice filled with determination. She shook her head. You can't fix everything, Ethan. His eyes burned into hers. I can fix this. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But she had trusted him once, and he had let her fall, and she wasn't sure if she could ever trust him again. She took a shaky breath, straightened her shoulders, and turned away. Goodbye, Ethan. She didn't look back, because if she had, she might have seen the rare flash of desperation in his eyes, and that would have been too dangerous, for both of them. Ethan Hartwell had built his empire on control. Every decision, every acquisition, every move he made was calculated, precise, untouchable. He had mastered the art of power, of keeping emotions out of the equation, of making decisions that served his vision, his company, his future. And yet, for the first time in his life, he had made a mistake that he didn't know how to fix. Letting Sophia Ramirez walk away was a failure he couldn't afford. And it wasn't about the company. It wasn't about Daniel, or reputation, or proving himself to the board. It was about her, the woman who had challenged him, the woman who had fought her way into his world, not by force, but by sheer determination and strength. The woman he had watched walk away from him, her eyes filled with hurt, with betrayal. And he had been the one who put it there. Ethan had spent the last few days working in the shadows, pulling every resource he had to uncover the truth. And now, finally, he had it. Now, it was time for war. Sophia wiped down the counter at the diner, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. It had been another long day of double shifts, of stretching every dollar, of trying to ignore the ache in her chest every time she thought about what she had lost. The life she had been building, the one she had fought so hard for, gone in an instant. A customer walked in and she forced a smile, ready to greet them, until she saw who it was. Ethan. Dressed in his tailored suit, his presence impossible to ignore, he stepped inside as if he belonged there, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. The diner fell silent. He was a man who didn't belong in places like this, a man who lived in a world of glass skyscrapers and private jets, not cracked linoleum floors and greasy coffee pots. Sophia swallowed hard, gripping the rag in her hands. "What are you doing here?" Ethan took a slow step forward, his voice low and firm. "Fixing my mistake." Her heart stammered. "Ethan—" Before she could stop him, he pulled out a folder, set it on the counter, and flipped it open. Sophia blinked, her stomach tightening as she saw the official company documents. "Daniel forged everything," Ethan said. "The transactions, the approvals, all of it. He set you up because he saw you as a threat, and I let him." Sophia stared at the proof, her breath catching. It was all there. The emails, the discrepancies, the evidence that Daniel had orchestrated her downfall. She should have felt relief. Instead, all she felt was anger. Her gaze snapped to Ethan's. "You knew this, and you still let me walk away." His jaw tightened. "I was waiting for the right moment." "There was no right moment, Ethan," she snapped, slamming the folder shut. "I lost everything because you wanted to play your game of power. You let me suffer while you sat back and waited." Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You think I don't regret it?" She let out a bitter laugh. "I don't care if you regret it. Regret doesn't change what happened." He stepped closer, his voice lower, rougher. "Then let me make it right." Sophia shook her head, taking a step back. "It's too late." Ethan's gaze darkened. "I fired Daniel." Sophia's breath hitched. He's finished," Ethan said, his voice quiet but lethal. "Stripped of his power, his position, and tomorrow morning the board will know the truth about what he did to you." Sophia's chest tightened. Ethan had destroyed Daniel. For her. Her mind spun, emotions colliding. Anger, relief, a raw, aching pain that she didn't know how to name. She had spent the last few weeks fighting to survive, believing she had lost, believing she had been abandoned. And now Ethan was standing in front of her, telling her that he had torn down the man who had tried to bury her. Her hands trembled as she closed the folder. "I don't know what you expect from me." Ethan's gaze softened. "Nothing." She swallowed, searching his expression for a game, a trap, a hidden agenda. But there was nothing. Only him. Raw. Unshielded. And maybe for the first time since she met him. Real. Ethan didn't move as Sophia closed the folder, her fingers trembling slightly. She could feel the weight of his stare, the unspoken words in the space between them. He had done the one thing she never expected. He had fought for her. But it didn't erase what had already happened. It didn't erase the hurt. "I can reinstate you," Ethan said, his voice quieter now. "Your job, your position, everything." Sophia let out a slow breath. "And what if I don't want to come back?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Then you don't have to." She blinked. She hadn't expected that answer. "No conditions," Ethan said, stepping closer, his voice steady. "No expectations. This isn't about the company anymore." Her heart pounded. Then what was it about? Ethan exhaled, his blue eyes holding hers. "It's about you." Sophia's throat tightened. She had spent so long fighting alone. She had never expected someone like Ethan Hartwell to stand beside her. But here he was. The man who had let her down. The man who had made it right. The man who was still waiting for her to decide if she could ever trust him again. Sophia closed her eyes for just a second, letting the weight of the moment settle in her chest. Then, slowly, she opened them again. And she made her choice.